So I think it's recording. Yes, it's recording.
Well, thank you, colleagues, friends. But very, very glad to start you off with your colloquium. But I'm particularly glad that you pushed me to rethink my terms, because I adopted them. I needed them, but it is really nice to rethink why certain categories are adopted and what kind of work they're doing, but also what kind of work we do not intend them to do and they might just start doing. I've been pressured to think also the danger of the terms I'm using. And there are two technical terms I use in my recent writing, and this is I speak about the meta crisis of capitalism. First, I spoke about the crisis of capitalism. And then my son, who studies physics, he was telling me about the metastable state. And then I said, that actually kind of expresses where I want to go with that. And so from a crisis of capitalism, the term became meta crisis of capitalism. I will talk about that, but then maybe also you can tell me what is misleading about that term as we come to discuss. And the other term I am appropriating and giving it, it's a meta term indeed. It is not a common term yet in the English language. It's precarity. So let me assure you that I did not adopt those terms frivolously. I remember very few things from my education before high school. Who does? But one thing I distinctly remember at the time, and we're talking the 1970s in communist Bulgaria, it was fashionable to import words from English and use them instead of existing Bulgarian words. Say, repressia instead of насилие, confrontatia instead of sbludek. And I had this wonderful literature teacher, still remember her name, Anna Modikian, who insisted that this is done in bad taste. It is snobbery. So I assure you that I've been rather hesitant to adopt these strange terms, but I needed them. And to explain why I needed them, I need to tell you a bit about my overall project. In my work, I have come up with a plan for subverting capitalism without relying on the help of any utopia like communism or socialism or a revolution. And I'm saying we don't even need a crisis of capitalism in order to affect radical change. So let me come clean here and disclose what in my biography pushes my thinking in this way. I was exactly 20 years old when I joined in the winter of 1988 the first dissident club in Bulgaria, an organization with ecological agenda. I did not become a dissident consciously and deliberately. I actually joined an ecological movement thinking that this is what a good communist does. In the movement, there were prominent members of the Communist Party, prominent intellectuals at the time in Bulgaria. And only after I had signed a certain petition that started the movement as a protest against the pollution in the city, I was told that this initiative did not have the blessing of the Communist Party. And this is how I inadvertently turned overnight from a good communist into a dissident. Now, I cannot speak for all of the dissidents. Well, there were a handful, but still we didn't know each other very well. But in my experience, the goal of our movement was not to replace socialism with capitalism. Back then, we were very much influenced by the thinking of Václav Havel, the playwright who was leader of the Czech dissident movement. So Havel claimed that these two socio-political systems, capitalism and state socialism, are incarnations of the same exploitative, alienating logic. Under state socialism, he claimed, as under capitalism, so they're very similar, people are afflicted by a condition he called samopohyb, which translates as self-waste. This particular sickness, this malaise, is called by our submission to the irrational momentum of anonymous, impersonal, and inhuman power, he wrote. The power of ideologies, systems, apparatus, bureaucracy, artificial languages, and political slogans. Further, Havel believed that these thoroughly ideological and often semantically confused categories, socialism and capitalism, have long since been beside the point, so useless. So I have come to believe back then, and I have not changed my position, from the very beginning of my intellectual awakening, that to structure the realm of our thinking through that dichotomy, communism versus capitalism, unduly constrains the imagination. Instead, we dissidents at the time aspired to end totalitarian socialism without embracing capitalism. And we did that without having any utopia in mind. The plan was that we were to fight against specific injustices. And as we did that, we might create a new form of society. So we focused on things like political oppression, the privileges of the ruling elite in a purportedly egalitarian society. There was this joke at the time that whiskey in the classless society, whiskey served only in first class. So these two particular convictions remained with me from those times. First, that we neither should be constrained by the binary choice, capitalism versus communism or socialism, nor seek to combine features of both as a solution, as was done under democratic capitalism after the Second World War in liberal democracies. And second, the second conviction that I have retained, and it is kind of clear in my writing, I hope, is that the alternative to capitalism and socialism can arise organically from radical struggles against the sources of injustice. But then I have a very peculiar definition of radicalism, which we can address later if we have time. So take, for example, the transition from feudalism to capitalism. It was done without any blueprint. In fact, the term capitalism was coined much later, about 100 years after the fact, sometime in the middle of the 19th century, when capitalism had established itself already as a social system. And then socialists in their criticism of the existing society labeled it capitalist. So we do not need to know in what direction we are moving on claiming, because, as I said, this comes directly from my experience with with the dissident movement in my native Bulgaria in the late 80s. So I believe that currently capitalist democracies find themselves in a very special moment of ripeness for change from within, what I call subverting capitalism, just like we were in the late 80s in Eastern Europe. Okay, so I felt I needed to give you this insight into where my mind is located, kind of to situate my project before we zoom in on these two terms that I'm using in my writing. So, how about precarity? I've chosen to label the contemporary form of capitalism precarity capitalism, and to claim that precarity is the social condition of our time. This is the social concern of our time. Now, precarity is a new word in the English language, which is based on precariousness. But it is not quite the same. The French use the word précarité. The Italians speak of precarietà. The Spanish have precariedad. The root is the Latin word precarius, which refers to something, and it's beautiful. Hold on. So it refers to something obtained through prayer or petition. Prayer or petition. Both strategies of obtaining something place one at the good will of others, deprives us of our agency. So the Oxford Dictionary dates the word precarity to the early 20th century. It defines it as the state of being precarious or uncertain. And then as a state of persistent insecurity with regard to employment or income. So there is this economic basis of the state of precarity. The Collins Dictionary lists precarity as a suggestive new word in 2017 with approval still pending. I like the definition there in the Collins Dictionary: a condition of existence without predictability or security, affecting material or psychological welfare. So it is not just about employment or income impoverishment or insecurity. There is a psychological welfare that is being the damage of that welfare is a sign of or a constitutive element of precarity. Now, let me give you a little bit of the use of that term in existing writing. Judith Butler made the term famous in her book, Precarious Life, The Powers of Mourning and Violence, that was published I think in 2004. I have not marked it here in my notes. There she draws the distinction between precariousness as a general human condition of vulnerability, rooted in our interdependence on each other, and precarity, which is socially generated vulnerability resulting from social marginalization, poverty, economic insecurity, political disenfranchisement, and or violence. A distinctive feature in Judith Butler's take on precarity is its unequal distribution. So some have to, there must be a group that is exposed to this condition, that is in that condition. It afflicts some groups. Guy Standing, the sociologist, speaks of a precarious class in this sense, a precariat, which is akin to the proletariat. But my claim is that, okay, basing myself on that, I observe that precarity, or this condition of uncertainty that afflicts our psychological and material well-being is not only a matter of impoverishment, it is a general social condition that is afflicting all, rich and poor, men and women, well-educated and low-skilled, irrespectively even of employment status. It is the anticipation of a job loss that can make one precarious. It is the experience of the stresses of a very terrible, very competitive job environment that can make us precarious, because we're losing our mental health as a result of these pressures. Thus, precarity, I came to think, or the conditions of existence without predictability or security affecting material or psychological welfare, is affecting the 99%. This is the real grievance, I claim, not inequality, as academics, politicians, and pundits keep insisting. Maybe out of habit, I don't know, but social protest has been using the old language of justice, in which equality takes pride of place. But it seemed to me rather strange that fighting inequality has become such an ubiquitous pastime for the left, and not only the left. So this dissatisfaction that something is amiss with our focus on inequality prompted me to start digging deeper about 10 years ago. Indeed, concerns with inequality have become celebrity politics. Christine Lagarde, now as a director of the European Central Bank and before as a managing director of the IMF, loves to criticize inequality. This obsession with inequality I find strange for three reasons. First, people, exactly those who are afflicted, the poor, don't seem to care. Okay, we can write it off as false consciousness. Moving on to the second reason, capitalist societies have always been unequal, but inequality was never much of an issue. So the question is, why now? And the third reason, traditionally, the radical left has not aspired for equality. Well, take Marx. Marx did not endorse equality as the trademark of communism. Remember there, the principle of distributive justice is to each according to their needs, not equality. So my initial intuition was that Western societies were suffering from a malaise that had no name. And labeling this condition inequality is making us pass the wrong diagnosis of the current condition of the conundrum. However, inequality is a statistical fact. I'm not disputing that. It is a problem in many ways. But then the question to ask is, when does the statistical fact of inequality become a form of social injustice? And the answer, to give it in a nutshell, the answer I found is, inequality becomes a problem when people's lives are so destabilized that personal wealth becomes the only source of stability. But this is an illusion, because no matter how rich or how equal, so how rich individually we are, or how equal within our societies we are, none of us can ensure for themselves a robust public healthcare service, because that needs enormous investment in research, education, culture for the sake of prevention, and then medical equipment, medical knowledge, medical service, which is achievable only through robust public investment. So it is the lack of that public provision, that reliable public provision of of essential needs, that makes us rely on individual wealth, to provide for that. But individual wealth, as I said, we would never be individually rich enough to provide for the stability we crave. So my research made me think that Western societies are suffering from this malaise, which had no name. So I adopted the name precarity, although it had already been given, but very recently, the connotation of a thing that requires inequality. I'm saying no, we can be all equal and still exposed to that uncertainty. So I'm talking about generalized precarity as the grave concern of our time. And the fact that this is indeed the curse of our societies has become crystal clear with the pandemic. Look, the United States has 4% of the world population, but a quarter of the COVID cases. It is almost the society most deeply afflicted by the condition of massive precarity. The case in Europe, again, big trouble with COVID, big trouble with precarity, a little less than the US on both counts. And so there seems to be some sort of a correlation between the pandemic and the condition of precarity. So I started digging. Well, my book was published in January, before the pandemic. So the pandemic is not my entry point. I just think that it sadly proves me right. But when I initially started digging into the causes of this generalized precarity, here is what I discovered. It is the child of neoliberalism, but I do not equate it with neoliberalism. And let me explain why I need to talk about precarity capitalism rather than just call it, like everybody else, neoliberalism. Okay, neoliberalism is a certain form of capitalism that engendered finally precarity, but neoliberalism has two main pillars. One, individuals are held responsible for a thriving society, so individual responsibility is the hallmark of neoliberalism. And the second is that the governments are held responsible for a thriving business environment and nothing more. So the governments take care of the market, individuals take care of themselves and of society. The latter element, that the main job of governments is to take care of the economy, already had emerged within the post-war interventionist welfare state, as governments actively manage domestic economies to mitigate economic crisis. So in the 3 post-war decades, this was done through an active stimulation of production and consumption at the cost of irreparable ecological damage. In the 1980s, in order to deliver on their commitment to increased prosperity, to prosperity for all, I mean in the West, for all in the West, governments across the left-right political divide embarked on what has become known as the third wave of globalization, the pursuit of economies of scale via global economic integration, which provided lucrative market access, thereby rapidly increasing returns on investment. So that was supposed to make us all rich and actually deliver on the promise made during the welfare state of inclusive prosperity for all. This is not wine, this is some cranberry juice. Raspberries, yes. So the digitalization of the economy simplified this process, as this allowed businesses to attain global reach with minimal cross-border investment. I'm just checking if still you can hear me, because I'm not hearing anybody, but they're nicely muted. Okay. However, the inauguration of globally integrated capitalism in the 80s imposed a new policy priority, that of maintaining the competitiveness, so shift from competition to competitiveness of national economies in the global market, where capitalist democracies were competing not only among themselves, but also with the autocratic capitalism of the likes of China and Russia, who maintained, at least initially, their competitive advantage by suppressing domestic consumption and depressing wages, as well as by foregoing compliance with norms of environmental sustainability. For Western governments, coping with these new competitive pressures entailed applying to themselves those structural adjustment policies they had previously prescribed to developing countries as conditionality for financial aid, as per the Washington Consensus policy formula. And this was typically labor market deregulation, cuts to public services and social insurance, and privatization of public assets. The desired objectives of increased competitiveness and growth were effectively achieved, notwithstanding early fluctuations and despite the financial meltdown of 2008 and 9. This prosperity, however, came at a heavy social price. The competitive pressures on the whole society intensified and broadened. These increasing pressures took place along two roads. On the one hand, due to labor market deregulation and automation, so the latter allowed jobs outsourcing in search of cheaper labor force, the political economy of Western societies no longer supplied employment as a stable source of livelihood. On the other hand, the thinning social safety net, and that is due to cuts to public spending on social services and social insurance, so that made a reliance on employment as a source of livelihood even more pressing. This massively increased the competitive pressures on individuals who were forced to assume responsibility for impossible tasks, such as remaining employable and employed within a political economy that does not produce sufficient number of stable jobs, or securing for themselves a robust healthcare and educational system, something that requires hefty public investment. So these were the two roads of precarization of our societies. Now, I admit we need to be very much aware that precarity is strongly stratified. Indeed, there is a competition of precarities, as Milena Kaczarska, my colleague from Plovdiv, once put it very aptly. So surely there is a significant stratification within precarity, and indeed, especially when precarity combines with impoverishment, this is very, very grave. But what is important to realize in order to fight the right fights is that the structural engine behind such conflicting experiences of injustice, as, let's say, on the one hand, the mental health crisis experienced by those trapped in the always-on economy, and these are the purported winners of capitalism, the purported winners of globalization. So that is on the one hand. On the other hand, the impoverishment of those unable even to enter the labor market, like the 20% unemployed youth unemployment in Spain. So the losers of globalization, the structural engine behind those conflicting experiences of precarity is the same, and that is the increased competition within globally integrated capitalism. And with the deliberate risk of repeating myself, these competitive pressures and the precarization of society will persist even if our societies were to become less unequal and even perfectly equal. This is the case because the root of precarization is not economic inequality, but the competitive pursuit of profit. And mind you, this is the constitutive dynamic of capitalism. So we should not blame it on neoliberalism. Because when we say that neoliberalism is the guilty one, is the culprit, we might imply that other forms of capitalism are better somehow. We could be looking for the solution with the welfare capitalism of the 50s and 60s. But this is exactly the capitalism that ruined the environment. So that is not the solution. These competitive pressures of globally integrated capitalism are also likely to persist if workers were to assume the property and management of the companies they employ them. And this is what has been advocated by people like Thomas Piketty in his grand critique of capitalism. But look, as long as these workers' livelihoods depend on how successfully their companies play the game of competition for profit within global integrated capitalism, these workers would support that game because they're trapped in that game, because their livelihoods depend on winning that game successfully. Okay. And this explains, I believe, the phenomenon of working class conservatism that we're seeing behind the Brexit vote, but behind also the Trump vote. It is this working class conservatism. If I have time, I could probably address that in more detail. At first in my writing, I was using the critique, I was using the term neoliberal capitalism as being the culprit of this situation. But the label was no longer fit for analysis. For example, neoliberalism is marked by a hands-off approach of the state to the economy, right? Leave it to the market. However, the state, at least since the turn of the century, or public authority, the EU, states, member states of the European Union, the US as a federal state. So public authority has been actively intervening to help hand-picked companies. So we're not even talking about the industrial policy of the old welfare state. We're talking about intervening to help the hand-picked companies. One of the first instances of this open political endorsement of national champions that marks precarity capitalism, and that's not a feature of neoliberalism. It was, so the first instance I give this example in my book is the politically managed deal Bill Clinton arranged, the access of the mobile technology company Qualcomm to the Chinese market. So the much reprimanded penchant of US President Donald Trump to negotiate deals with and for specific companies, for example, excluding Apple's iPhone produced in China from the 2019 tariffs he imposed. In fact, that perfectly inscribes itself within the policy logic already established at the close of the 20th century. Now, what is changed? So until recently, capitalism has relied on its, for its general acceptance, for its legitimacy, on a certain correlation between risk and opportunity. The story goes, you risk your capital, you risk your time, you risk your efforts, and you're rewarded with profits. So risk and opportunity for profit were correlated for every participant. At least that's the ideal case. But in the early 20th century, public authorities started to actively aggregate the opportunities to these companies which already had a competitive advantage, who were positioned in the global economy to reap the benefits of the economies of scale. So public authorities started actively supporting those companies and to pile the risk onto the small fish, onto society. That resulted in a massive increase of competitive pressures that generated precarity. So what I'm suggesting is that under the new liberal form of capitalism, the state economy relation is hands off, leave it to the market. In the new form, the state economy relation is different. It is helping the powerful economic actors, helping those who can secure, who can enhance the competitiveness of national economies in the global market, because it is not competition, but competitiveness that is the value. And there is a second great difference between neoliberal capitalism and the new form I'm analyzing. And this is how, on the level of personal motivation to participate. The current form is motivation by fear. The previous form, the motivation was opportunity. So neoliberal capitalism draws its legitimacy from a notion of individual self-reliance in chasing exciting opportunities. Luc Boltanski and Yves Chiapello have described that in a book that came in the late 90s. They call that the new spirit of capitalism. So it is capitalism with a sex appeal that seduces us with the promise of opportunities, with the promise of that we can sit by the swimming pool and write our books and manage our investments, our stock portfolio. So the capitalism has lost its sex appeal because currently it motivates exclusively by fear, and not only the losers of globalization, also the winners of globalization. I will come back to that. How much time do I still have?
Well, we have until 2:30, so we still have 46 minutes. But
interrupt me whenever you think that we have enough stuff to discuss. My plan is to exhaust this issue of precarity. Why precarity? And then only briefly touch on the meta crisis, because there's, as you'll see, there is a logical connection. So let me go for another 10 or 15 minutes. Is that okay?
I was wondering maybe if you could take some questions and comments, like one round of remarks.
Already? Fine?
That's
fine. That's fine.
whether maybe people have some.
Let's stop here and talk. Yeah.
And then we'll have round two. Great. So I see.
I just want to add, because I said that there are three features of precarity capitalism that are different from neoliberal capitalism, and I covered the two. Let me just say the third feature is autocratic politics. Corona, and we're seeing this very clearly during the pandemic. The corollary to the precarization of society is the increased autocratic style of the state's response. And it makes sense because the state is supposedly only there to take care of the economy. It is not there to take care of society. So to social disintegration, to the massive precariousness that causes crime and destitution, the state responds with security measures, from criminalization of poverty to extending the police's domain of operation to curbing migration. So these are the three features of precarity capitalism that are not, that are missing from neoliberal capitalism. All right, let me stop here and over to you.
Great, thank you so much. We use stack, the stack method for discussion. So basically, if somebody puts an asterisk in the chat, they have a comment. And if somebody has two, then they have a direct response to something that was just mentioned. So they get to jump the line. And I see that Jess is saying, Professor Asmanova, I think your microphone might be at the front of your computer, because when you put your hands down, you muffle yourself. Yeah, I noticed the change a little bit.
Really? I have no idea. It's a new computer.
We can still.
I know you were asking at the beginning about the camera and stuff, and I was helping you with it. So I just wanted to let you know, I think when you put your hands down on your computer or something, it muffles the sound, and then when you lift it up, suddenly we could hear you again. So I'm not sure where it is, but I just was trying to help.
Whoa, my computer is far away from me. So my hands are not on it.
Okay, I have no idea.
Good to know. So I'll keep my hands. I gesticulate a lot. So
sorry.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. Good.
Okay.
We can still hear you, but there is this change.
But yeah, all right. Sorry. Good. All right. Who's first? Don.
So thank you so much. I wanted to ask about. I understand this notion that logically inequality and precarity are different notions. One can imagine an equal society that's full of precarity. One can imagine an unequal society that's full of safety. At the same time, these things seem to be not accidentally intertwined, right? When you have the level of inequality we have now, the control of the society rests in the hand of a very few people who appear to have an interest in precarity for maintaining their own power. And so could you talk a little bit more about, well, although these things may be logically distinct in practice, there's an overlap. And when you got to the question of the autocratic governments at the end and the interest in criminalizing poverty, you seem to be pointing towards that linkage. So I'm just curious if you could elaborate on that, especially if I look at those societies which have less precarity, they, I think, tend to be not as grossly stratified with inequality. I'm not sure I can think of a grossly unequal society that provides security, but I could be wrong. And I'm thinking present anyway. So if you could just talk about how those things do and don't link, I'd love to hear that.
Okay. All I'm saying is that exactly that link that you point cannot be assumed. It should be investigated, but we are not investigating it. Despite, there now whole degrees, academic degrees in inequality studies. Probably soon there will be a Nobel Award of some sort called Inequality Fight. But there is not a serious study, I have not seen one, examining the link because of this very strong assumption that this is what the source of the problem is. However, it is, at least in basic economic studies, and it is in the in fact, in the research of the World Bank and the UNDP, that there is also a correlation between diminished poverty and inequality, because when we are thinking about when we're thinking about wealth, not as an entity to be distributed, but an entity to be produced, then we need to acknowledge that the process matters, the process through which that wealth is produced. So let's think for a moment about how our societies produce their wealth. They produce them in capitalist society based on personal investment of time, money, effort. People who start a cookie factory, they do not start the cookie factory because they love cookies, but because they believe they're going to make a buck. So the motivation is profit. It is the profit motive. Now, if we disagree with the profit motive, we should criticize the profit motive. We should not endorse the outcome of the profit motive and say, oh, the outcomes are fine, but we have to distribute them equally. Because if you distribute equally, you will destroy the profit motive. So it's a matter of basic consistency. And then in the course of the pursuit of profit and the creation of material prosperity, then the poor are not as poor. Even as inequality grows, it is an established, statistically established fact that the poor are less poor. So the problems are of different order. And what I'm suggesting is that if we disagree with the process, let us criticize the process. I have not done any further investigation of the link between inequality and precarity. This is something that needs to be done. I'm under enormous pressure to apply for funds, because nowadays you are not a worthy academic if you do not, win funds. So I might put in a funding application to study that. Although I'm a political theorist, I'm not sure that I'm even equipped, but probably I will collect a team and approach you if you would like to participate. Yeah. This is my answer. I cannot answer this any better than this.
I mean, I think there's a case to be made that the profit motive is actually underlying both phenomena.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I certainly agree, right? If one could get rid of precarity,
then who cares?
Let Jeff Bezos be a trillionaire.
Right, exactly. So what I'm saying that if we focus on precarity rather than inequality, we do not risk to go back into this socialist oppression, or, because this is the price we pay for equal societies that allow. So the idea is to have, well, if you ask me, the ideal is to have liberal communism. So to have such robust provision of the basic needs of people that inequality would not matter, to make it irrelevant rather than non-existent. This is where I would go. Yeah.
I have what I think is a related question. Is there someone in staff before me? No. Okay. I have what I think is a related question that is about what you've just said, related to what you've just said about your own need to go get some grants. So we talk, this may be a self-serving question, but we talk all the time about the neoliberal university and how the university itself has become a kind of neoliberal institution, that it operates on business logics, and it's easy to diagnose all of the problems associated with that. At the same time, I think within the context of the university, it's so, and thank you so much for joining us today, by the way, this is really wonderful. But it's so easy it's so easy to see exactly what you're saying from within the context of the university, where so many of us are writing from privileged positions, while at the same time, you know, like even those among us who are tenured, I think, at least of a certain generation, are constantly under threat of, you know, some kind of precarity in one way or another. But I'm wondering about the profit motive, and I'm wondering about how to speak about institutions like universities that are not for profit, but are nevertheless subject to similar kinds of logics and regimes. In other words, I guess it's just a question about language. Do we keep talking about the university or academia as neoliberal institutions, or is there some other language that is better suited?
Okay. My fear is that when we drop capitalism from the formulation, we kind of tacitly say, oh, capitalism is okay. It is just neoliberalism, as if neoliberalism and capitalism are different things. So we should, to start with, always say neoliberal capitalism, at least. And then clarify that neoliberalism has extended the logic of the profit motive to its extremes. So that we're not endorsing you know, a little bit of a softer form, because we've tried the softer forms. They destroyed the environment, that softer form. Okay, so something about the profit motive that I've been thinking. Now, economic growth in itself, it's not the problem. And profit in itself is not the problem. I mean, of course, remember the market societies at the dawn of capitalism. Of course, I will not be motivated to very much to produce anything at a loss. I would go for profit. But Marx speaks of the motive. It is not about profit itself, it is the profit motive. It's the motivation of economic activity through the pursuit of profit. So this is a very important nuance, that we can run the economy on market principles, and that's why I believe in market societies. I don't think the market is the problem, and neither is the state ownership or the collective ownership the solution. I think the market is okay as long as we as society do not fall into, you know, the dominance of the profit motive, and this can be done through, you know, public policy.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
So I think I'm next. Thank you so much for this. The more I listened to you, I really enjoyed your writing. And I felt like it had great explanatory power. It literally explains some of the things that kind of come up, but people don't know how to interpret them. I'll give you one example. In Russia, the support, like the state support for certain corporations, sometimes intellectuals on the left interpret it as sort of proto-socialist. They're like, well, you know, we're kind of building the infrastructure covertly for future socialism, right? Developing those large enterprises, economies of scale at a state, supported, almost state-run. So I think your framework really explains what's happening. I think that's what you're talking about as sort of the feature of new capitalism.
Right. Thank you. I admit it's been hard for me as a theorist to delve into these economic issues, but you know, you have to unravel that. So yes, and also this talk about big state nowadays, because there's so much money, so much intervention by public authority. This is no socialism. Socialism is about you know, overcoming or objecting to the profit motive. Public companies, take Huawei. Huawei is one of the biggest, most successful players in the global capitalist economy. It is owned by the workers. So China is, state-managed capitalism. Clearly, the solution is not in state support to companies, because these companies can be driven as profit-pursuing entities with all the exploitative dynamics and all the destruction of nature that we know from classical capitalism.
If I may continue, I had the second part to my remark.
Okay.
What you're doing reminds me, and I think it's just because of the moment we're in, of the work of McKinsey Wark, Capital is Dead, is this something worse, where he basically, or they make an argument that we're entering, well, they're looking for a name for a new state of affairs. And they're suggesting that we are actually entering a new formation that Marx hasn't anticipated, hasn't thought of. It's neither capitalism nor socialism or communism, but they claim something worse. And they call it like the, I don't think they give it a name, but they talk about ownership of information, rentism, and the victorial class. They talk about the victorial class as being sort of the new ruling class that is in struggle with the old ruling class. So, and Joe Dean develops an idea about neo-feudalism.
Neo-feudalism. No, I think these are very on the point, very good studies. I totally support what they're saying. I just give it a name, precarity capitalism. It doesn't matter really what we call it. I do not think that it is not a capitalist, because I define I'm a Marxist in that sense. I define capitalism through what I call its constitutive principle, and this is the pursuit of profit. As long as a society is committed to that purpose, it is capitalism. Even if there is no private property of the means of production, if that entity plays the game of competitive pursuit of profit, it's capitalist. And I can find proof in Marx on that. I really believe that this is, when he talks about, his analysis is centered on commodity production, but this is exactly the process of commodity production. It is enabled by the private ownership of the means of production, but the essence is goods produced for market exchange in order to make profit. So it is the pursuit of profit that is at the center, that is definitional of capitalism according to Marx. The man wrote in the 19th century, there was not so much competition at the time. So because of the very clear ownership structures reduced competition among the entities. Now, because that ownership structure is very nebulous, not nebulous, what is the word? It's not very clear. I mean, with these publicly listed companies, we're all owning them through our pension funds. Everybody's a capitalist. So because we are no longer nobody is, on the one hand, everybody is engaged in the pursuit of profit through these publicly listed companies that are running our pension funds. And because the ownership structure no longer securely shelters people from these competitive pressures. So that exposes everybody to this competition. So I still think it is very much capitalism.
Okay, Rob.
I'm jumping in. Hi there, thank you so much for this. I really loved the anti-capital article. I thought it was razor sharp. I wanted it to go on longer. So my question is really about the end of that article.
Okay.
This notion of subversion that you come up with. I'm really interested in the idea of subverting capitalism, how this relates to struggle, how this fits in with sort of traditional versions of Marxism, how is this different?
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, can you repeat your last sentence? How is it different?
Yeah, how do you see this version of subversion relating to more traditional Marxist?
Yeah. Okay, I have a short answer to you. Read my book, but I'll give you an answer. So subversion. Subversion is alternative to the Marxian way of ending capitalism. In Marx, capitalism ends in two ways: through revolution, and the revolution and that proceeds with the expropriation of private property. Alternatively, capitalism collapses as a result of the tension between the development of the means of production and then the stagnant relations of production. So at some point, it's going to enter into such deep crisis that it would no longer be able, it might mutate into something else. I see those two versions, although only the revolutionary one is the popular one in the academic community and beyond. So let's say that capitalism within Marxian scholarship collapses in two ways: revolution or terminal crisis. I'm saying that there is another way, and subversion is about elimination of the constitutive dynamic of capitalism, which is the competitive pursuit of profit, by other means. It can, so any policy that strikes at the constitutive dynamic of capitalism is subverting it. It might not be radical in the sense of destruction and expropriation of property, but in my understanding, it is radical exactly because it strikes at the root of capitalism. And here I'm actually quoting Marx. Radical, he says, is whatever is to take the things by the root, to uproot. So there are other things in the operation of capitalism. So I'm talking about its constitutive principle, the competitive pursuit of profit. Then we have structuring institutions like the private ownership of the means of production, which is just a structure enabling the pursuit of profit. And then we have distributive outcomes like inequality, exclusion. But what I'm saying is that neither the elimination of the structuring institutions nor the elimination of the distributive outcomes is radical politics. It needs to be done. It will bring us along the way. It is progressive politics. So for me, progressive politics is anything that works on those three levels. I call them levels of injustice. Relational injustice, I call injustice which is rooted in the unequal distribution of power, and that translates into inequality and exclusion. So we need to fight that. Second, we need to fight the structuring institutions, such as private forms of organization of management and production. So whatever institutions are helping the process. But ultimately, we need to fight the constitutive logic of capitalism. And I define as radical politics only the third one. There is nothing radical about calls for redistribution. In fact, I have this term, the paradox of emancipation. I say that efforts to achieve inclusion within a system and equality within a system only validate that system further. So our very noble fight for equality and inclusion is making us complicit with the system within which we seek equality and inclusion. And we see that very well with feminism. When second generation feminists were fighting for equality with men in the rat race, they embraced the rat race and even, made it worse. because there was more competition. So I'm just appealing to, you know, self-identified progressive forces. I hate the word progressive actually, because it means that our opponents are what? Regressive. There's a hubris in the label progressive, but that's another discussion. Yeah, where was I? Yes, so my appeal is, when we are fighting those noble fights for equality and inclusion, let us not glorify the system within which we want that equality and inclusion. Otherwise, we're trapped in the paradox of emancipation, that we deepen one injustice as we fight another.
Thanks so much.
Anyone else? Yizel? You're muted.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us here. I really enjoyed the readings that you wrote, and I just shared with the group here an article that also kind of, well, it's about like influencer, like internet celebrity, but it also talks about like how internet celebrity is actually glorifying precarity model.
I'd love to check it out. Did you put it on the chat?
Oh yeah, I will put it on the chat. I mean,
Oh, please do. All right.
yes. So so in that article, they mentioned something about like how the term precarity has been overused, and so they also think that to a certain extent that it conflates the struggles between the Uber work offer with the kind of more prestigious sort of position like artists or new media and entrepreneurs. So I'm just wondering like your take on this.
Yeah. Again, two answers. Read my book.
Okay.
The book. So in the book, the solution is, but I'll give you a solution.
Mm-hmm.
So there, I'm saying that, you know, the big question of our time is, economically speaking, is about voluntary versus forced flexibility. So voluntary flexibility gives you the, you know, the freedom of control of your life, of, you know, accepting this job or that job. So that flexibility is wonderful. That is not precarity. As long as it is voluntary flexibility, it is very welcome. And I have a whole plan. I make a big deal out of the conditions for voluntary entry and exit from the labor market. Yeah. And yeah, so I have a big plan on how to increase the voluntary nature of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But indeed, there is a danger. We need to be very careful, you know, not to dismiss the real grievances of the people who are in the lowest step of the precaritization stratification, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I admit that it's a problem. Yeah. And as every term, you know, every term can be hijacked for nefarious purposes. Look what happened with communism. It was hijacked. 68 was hijacked. You know, people say the 68ers prepared neoliberalism. But their cause, I mean, of irreverence and, you know, irreverence towards public authority was hijacked by neoliberalism. That doesn't mean that they didn't have a good cause. So yes, we need to be cautious about the possibility of these terms to be hijacked. Thank you for raising that, Yisul.
I just posted the article that Isol mentioned.
Okay.
So you could check it out later.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Ala.
Yeah, to the chat. So I think, you know, I'm you know, I get what you're saying. I still can't escape kind of the logic that I'm used to, the logic of the crisis. I want to go back to the notion of the crisis, because it seems to me that you know, in Precarity Capitalism, in the chapter, you end the chapter by saying that the possibility of overcoming capitalism has never been as attainable as in our times. And I was like, what? Say more. But there's the article.
Okay.
And then, you know, it kind of like the same effect on the article. I'm like, well, tell us more about what it means to subvert capitalism. Like, I'm still curious about sort of the program. And here's why. Because to me, it seems like we're still waiting for the crisis, like a big crisis of capitalism that would allow for the system to either fail or to be smashed. And smashing is like,
don't hold your breath.
So there is not, like, David Harvey makes an argument like this in 17 Contradictions of Capitalism. He says, well, you know, capitalism, all of those contradictions, including climate crisis, capitalism is going to be able to overcome, and here's how. So it seems to me you're saying, like, now crisis is a perpetual state, and this meta stable state.
Let's get to the meta crisis. Well, see, so there's generally a very bad news and very good news. So let's start with the bad news. The bad news is that precarity makes people conservative. So against the expectation of the left that, you know, all these horrible things that are happening, especially after the financial meltdown and austerity, is going to radicalize and push people to the left. No, precarity is making people desire stability and go for the familiar, and the familiar is the rule of these new liberal elites. That explains the vote to the likes of Trump and to the likes of Boris Johnson. This is the working class conservatism that is a very peculiar thing that has been happening over the past 10 years, at least. That precarity is making people conservative. However, so it is making paradoxically, precarity is making the losers of the game conservative and defenders of the status quo, because they feel threatened of change. But at the same time, the winners of the game, even if they continue to be winners, they no longer enjoy the game, let me put it this way, because these elites, well, the people who am I talking about? I'm not talking about the 1%. I'm talking about the upper middle class professionals who are trapped in the always on economy. Even if they have good jobs, well-paid jobs, they're also socialized socialized, educated in a way to value a different type of life with more leisure, more culture, family life, friends, travel. You know, it's a different life that they value. And this was already observed by Joseph Schumpeter in the 40s, saying, you know, people are educated to value this kind of life. But the winners in the competitive game, so the price that they're paying in order to be winners is to live a life they don't value. So it is a new situation that the winners in the game of capitalism consciously alienated of capitalism, not theoretically like Marx had it. You know, it's so. My hope is that once this game is no longer supported by the winners in the game, it is going to no longer be sustainable. This is actually my insight, if you want to call it that. And here is the proof that something like this is going on. take the European Green Deal. Are you familiar with that? So the European Commission, the new European Commission, which comes from the center right, so it's the Christian Democratic parties are mostly represented in that. They're pushing for the European Green Deal, and that Green Deal has also a strong social dimension. So they're going against the joint objection of labor and of labor and capital, but pushing through with the European Green Agenda. So something is going on. The very elites are going against the objections of both the working class, because the workers are afraid that this is going to deprive them of jobs, and of the capital owners, of the capitalists as well, because their competitiveness will be damaged in their competition with China. So the European Commission, which is this elite entity ideologically dominated by the center right, is going for this, for a European Green Deal. If another example to give that these things have that progressive and radical things have been done by elites, take the idea of rule of law, 1215, the British barons. Well, of course they were acting in their own interest, but in order to make sure that those things are inalienable, that they're not personal favors, that they're secured, they had to phrase them in universal terms with historic consequences. So what I'm saying is not that I believe in elite policy making, but I believe that under our pressure, under civil society pressure, we could push for policy changes in the direction, what I call radical politics, against the competitive pressures of global capitalism. And we do not need to wait for, to enact that with the democratic vote. Actually, this is not in the book, but this is in my recent writing. There I align with Rosa Luxemburg and those early 20th century socialists who ridiculed the social democrats' belief in democratic politics. Rosa Luxemburg has this beautiful text saying, yeah, and what, are we all going to put it to the democratic vote and have a nice discussion, and then everybody is going to say, oh yeah, let's give up capitalism and move on to something better. To the extent that the workers' interest is in the short-term health of capitalism, the democratic vote is not going to deliver radical politics. I have no illusions about that.
Dawn,
But pressure, yes. Pressure on elites, yes.
Time is short, Ala, so I can defer if you want to turn to something else to wrap up, or I can raise my question.
I was just calling up on you.
Okay. So two brief comments. One of them is, as you were saying, right, this question of these elites who are endorsing the Green Initiative, right? There seems to be sort of a three-layered stratification of those in the greatest position of precarity and lack of wealth, favoring the sort of conservative neoliberal regime. You have the billionaires, the uber wealthy, also promoting that. And then you have some sort of middle range of people who are frankly well off, but are looking at this. And so there's an interesting question there as how that works.
Yeah, very nice. I had not thought about it, but you're right. Yes.
And so, and then the other question I have, though, you were also talking about how there's this, right, the elites who are favoring these things and talking about the rule of law. I'm wondering if you have anything to say about Hernando de Soto. He had his book many years ago, right, The Mystery of Capital. And de Soto's argument, as I recall, I read this a long time ago, was that capital, the roots of capital are actually in the rule of law, in the sense that you have clear and reliable ownership of property. And without that, capital is meaningless. And so there's an interesting intersection of those who are seeking to perpetuate the neoliberal order are actually, there's a tension with the tendency towards autocracy and government picking winners, because then you're ceding control. And I'm not sure where that goes, but there seems to be some interesting interplay there.
Very well indeed. Tension with that. So to me, yes, so the rule of law, or or the nominally free labor contract, things like this, these are the structuring institutions. Yeah, so they enable capitalism to run its game smoothly. So indeed, these capitalists would not have it, this autocratic, arbitrary rule.
About predictability.
Yeah.
Unless you're so powerful that you can control the game yourself.
Yeah. Yes, but nobody is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it doesn't work. So you're saying that opposition to the current setup can come also from the typical Financial Times readers. The Financial Times, if you look at their articles, they're criticizing neoliberalism because it is no longer good capitalism, right?
And I think that can also be, why you see the stratification, right? If you're worth $1 billion or more, there's basically nothing society can do to you, right? So yeah, the rules change, whatever. You create the environment. Yeah, right. And if you're in the sort of middle range, you sort of like, absolutely. Well, I could lose this, right? I've made it, right. But I could lose it if the predictability isn't there. So yeah, the Financial Times reader is a good image.
Yeah. All right, I'm taking a note of that, and if I use this bit, I will reference it to you. Yep, done. Spectre, right. And please make sure all of you, let's email me so as we're in touch.
Yeah.
I'll pick your minds. Next.
Albina, $1 million question. What would a liberal communism look like?
I just have to say, really? A capitalist way to frame your question?
Well, okay, so a liberal communism, this is what we wanted at the time. It would not, it would combine the cultural liberalism, some dose of economic liberalism once, the commons are protected, once everything, the essentials of life are secured without the profit motive, then you can allow, some sort of enterprise, private property. Actually, if you read the Communist Manifesto, Marx was saying that private property will be part of communism. What he wanted to eradicate is bourgeois property, of the means of production. So personal property is okay. So I don't know if that answers, but like Marx, I think Marx was pressured by Engels to write the Communist Manifesto. Marx believed in critique of capitalism, not in designing blueprints. And this is where I really prefer to stay. I prefer not to have a blueprint. I think that in our current situation, maybe a blueprint would be nice because it would not make people so conservative. Actually, people are so conservative. Those who are afflicted by precarity are so conservative exactly because there is no blueprint. But at the same time, an aversion to capitalism or opposition to capitalism is a more reliable common denominator than any utopia we might offer, because then people are going to start discussing, you know, what is liberal communism rather than fight capitalism. Do I get away with this?
We just we talked about negative definitions in the morning. Things like
Yeah.
non-white. What else did we mention? Things like and we define things by opposition. And we're wondering, we're talking about the challenge of negative definitions, but it seems like you're actually going for a negative definition.
I am going to, you know, I've been schooled in I come from the Frankfurt School, okay? Already under communism, I was reading the Frankfurt School people, the first generation, not the second generation, not Habermas, but the first generation. And there, you know, Adorno has this bit saying, even if we don't know what is right, we know that something is amiss. So I'm saying, let us be driven by what is amiss, and that thing that is amiss, it can be defined in substantive terms. It doesn't have to be in a negative term, right? We have to strive to give it a name. Like, say, is it exploitation? Is it alienation? Is it inequality? So I think it's important to give names to the grievance and to the social harm and to the social injustice in specific terms. But what I'm saying is that let's be driven by what is our sense of injustice rather than by a telos, by you know, a well-defined direction. This is how I understand immanent critique, like from within.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So we are at 2:32.
Yeah.
So any last, and then there is time for one last comment if you are dying to make one. I mean, yeah.
Yes, I'm just, it's my proposal to please let's stay in touch. And Dawn, I've taken notes. You're in my next publication, whether you like it or not. Yeah.
We'll co-author something on metastable states.
I'd love to tell me if that, because my son was cautioning me that the social scientist should not draw on physics, but it was just too tempting.
Yeah.
Couldn't resist. So we have another talk. You tell me how wrong I am.
I'm always happy to see metaphors leap from one place to another.
Yeah. Okay.
So, I mean, it's important to get them right, but I mean, I will say that it's not a metaphor that made me cringe. It's a metaphor that like I could see that working. I'd have to think through it more carefully, but it was not obviously problematic, which oftentimes these things are.
Okay, thank you.
But I'll look at it a little more carefully and maybe send you something.
Please, yes, because I really want to capture that thing that our societies are in agitation, in inflammation, but don't have sufficient energy to exit that state, and yet they're not in a calm state. So I think that's what I get, that middle stage between neither excited nor calm state.
I mean, I think the main thing is that the metastable state in physics, it's not going to stay there. It's not permanent, but it's not necessarily agitated. It would need agitation. So I'll try to write something up.
Okay.
And if you don't hear from me after a little bit, our semester's about to start, just ping me and say, you promised me this, and then I'll sit down and I'll write it.
Okay, I will chase you.
Yeah, please do.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much for joining us. Normally we would wine and dine you and have you
I'll
here,
go have a glass of wine now. All
Not
right.
you, I think. Well,
Good.
yeah, so be well, and we'll be in touch.
We shall.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ella. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Alana.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you.
And let's take a break and convene in a couple minutes.
Okay, I'm exiting now.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye. Bye.